Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're keeping safe and well. I've got a very, very special guest on this evening, a transfer special with Charlie Eccleshare, former journalist with the Daily Telegraph and now Tottenham Hotspur correspondent with The Athletic. Charlie, good evening. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Just wanted to start today's video by talking about the Chelsea game. Obviously, yesterday, a 2-0 defeat, Antonio Conte's first defeat in the Premier League as Spurs boss. And what you've made of Antonio Conte's time at Spurs so far?
I've been really impressed by and large. I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because you sort of take out the trilogy of Chelsea defeats, and I think it's quite a positive picture. But obviously, that does cast a bit of a negative light on it. But I still think overall, it's easy to forget kind of how low the club felt in that. I think back to that Saturday night at the end of October when Nuno's getting booed, sack the board, all of this sort of stuff was in that miserable 3-0 loss to United. And at that point, the idea that Spurs would be in a pretty healthy position in the top four race would have seemed, I think, fairly far-fetched, even though in points terms, they weren't a million miles away. So, the fact that Conte's come in, it feels like at least there's a sense of purpose. And I know the Chelsea defeats have been a bit miserable, but they're kind of gone now. I've said it many times. I think games against Chelsea aren't going to decide whether Spurs get in the top four or not. If they can be consistent against the teams around them and below them, as they've been under Conte, and yes, you could say the games have been fairly straightforward on paper. He's not had the toughest run, but still, 6 wins, 3 draws before yesterday is a really good haul, I think, from those games. So all in all, I've been very impressed, and I think we should try and just forget about Chelsea as much as we can and be grateful that Spurs don't have to play them for a long, long time now.
Charlie, how confident are you of Tottenham Hotspur finishing in the top four now under Antonio Conte?
I feel pretty confident. I mean, United, that late goal was annoying for them to win on Saturday, and from what I'm told, they didn't play very well. And I think they're probably the biggest threat, because I think Arsenal is still a little bit working out what they're trying to do, a bit in transition. I don't think West Ham have the squad for it, especially with having to play in the Europa League. Spurs not having Europe is massive, and I've been basically since they qualified for the Conference League, I was saying get out of that as much as you can, get out of that competition. So I think that was a huge blessing in a not even particularly good disguise, a pretty clear blessing, to be honest. Them going out of that competition, so they're my favourites to do it. And if you look at the league table, they're in a pretty strong position with the games in hand. So yeah, they're my favourites out of obviously the 3 are kind of miles away. I know that Spurs could, in theory, actually go above Chelsea if they win all their games in hand. But I think on the evidence of the last few weeks, Chelsea look quite a lot better. But I think to get 4th spot, I think they'll do it.
Charlie, I've got to ask you, as a journalist, going into press conferences with the likes of Mauricio Pochettino, then Jose Mourinho, now Antonio Conte, talk about being spoiled as a journalist. Who's been your favourite to date?
Great question. I mean, yeah, I've been so spoiled. My in terms of like stuff happening, my second day in the job was the 7-2 home defeat to Bayern Munich, and I kind of thought, okay, that's a bit of a crazy start, but I'm sure things will calm down soon. And 2.5 years later, I'm still kind of waiting for things to calm down. It's just been so eventful. Of those 3, I mean, they have different kind of different strengths and weaknesses. I mean, Pochettino, even though it was coming to the end, he still had a charm to him. Mourinho was fascinating because, and especially the in-person ones, it was a shame because obviously after a few months of him being in charge, they went behind closed doors. But seeing him in person, I mean, he still, for all, and many people have serious gripes with Jose Mourinho, which I understand, but I think just judged on press conferences, he's still the master. I mean, the way everything was so well thought out, he's a great orator. He could be funny. He could be spiteful and nasty, often all within the same press conference. I found him very interesting. You'd rarely come away from a Jose Mourinho conference and not have something to write about or find a bit near. Whereas, some managers are like that. Conte's come in, and again, I find him very interesting. And it was a bit tantalizing because we had a few face-to-face ones at Hotspur away, but then they went back to Zoom. And it's harder in Zoom because you don't get the eye contact in the same way. You don't get the feel of a guy. But Conte has a real charisma. I mean, you see him up close and you can see why he gets players to run through brick walls for him, because he does have a magnetism and a gravitas. So I've enjoyed them all. I think press conferences, I would put Jose as the kind of most, what's the right word? The most kind of captivating, I suppose. He still had that ability with a presser to kind of bend the world to his will a little bit. He knew what he was doing. He'd say this little thing, and often he'd pretend that it was just coming to him. It's not. He's smart. He was doing it kind of deliberately. But yeah, we've been so blessed with that. And I guess as a kind of counterbalance, we had a few months of Nuno, and Nuno was not great in press conferences. We'd sort of been warned about this before, that he doesn't really see the point of them, doesn't enjoy them, and that came across. And I think, you don't want to overplay, because as a journalist, we're in that world and we're obsessed with it and we think it's all important. And for a lot of the time, no one really cares. But I do think, how you are in press conferences is important in building up a relationship with the fans and, presenting yourself as someone who really cares and is passionate. Maybe these things shouldn't matter, but they do. And I think that was a bit of a misstep from him. And Conte is really interesting at the moment, because I think some Spurs fans, and be interested to get your take on this, have found the way he was after certainly the first Chelsea defeat, where he was very negative. I think a lot of Spurs fans bristled at that and felt that was quite Mourinho-esque. Interestingly, yesterday he was less like that and more positive towards the team. But, and he's using those press conferences as well as a way of saying to his superiors, look, I'm not going to take a backward step here. This is how I feel. And they knew that when they appointed him. I'm going to shoot from the hip and, like it or lump it.
Well, I think that's how we all feel, though, Charlie, as Spurs fans, because we can see the quality difference. And me personally, I actually like Antonio Conte coming out and saying, there is a real quality difference, because we want to be back into that top four. We want to be playing back in the Champions League, certainly what we've tasted anyway. And of course, we want to win a trophy, because the last trophy, 2008, so long. For the viewers, I just would like you to take us behind the scenes a little bit. What is it like being a journalist following Tottenham Hotspur?
Well, it's great fun. And it's very busy because they are always doing things. And to give you insight, that people always said, like, during even say March 2020, April 2020, start of that lockdown, and people were saying, "Oh, you must be bored. There must be nothing to write about." Saying this is Tottenham Hotspur. They're furloughing staff. They're reverse. There's always something. Staff. There's always something. Even in a lockdown where there was no football happening, they still found a way of kind of being front and center. They are. And we're biased, I guess, because we're in that bubble. We're very Spurs-centric. But I do genuinely think they've been one of the newsiest clubs over the last few years. There's just so much going on at that club. So you kind of have to be on your toes all the time. If there's ever a quiet day or a quiet week, you feel, there's that disconcerting, and you're like, something's brewing here, isn't it? It's just, it can't be quiet for too long. So it's good, it's great in that sense. And like I say, that's also challenging. I think also from and maybe this is boring, but from a kind of facilities point of view, I know everyone hears this the whole time, but Spurs is fantastic from that point of view, with the stadium, with the training ground, which is where press conferences take place. So, when you're there, you are reminded that this is a club that feels on the up and all of that. But yeah, it's if you want to learn a lot as a journalist and get to write really interesting pieces and interact with really interesting people, then it's a great club to follow. But I wouldn't recommend it if you if you want a quiet life, because as you know, supporting the club, that just never really happens.
I just wanted to ask you, Charlie, actually, thinking back to when Mauricio Pochettino was sacked late evening, and then, of course, very early morning, Jose Mourinho took over. I expect a lot of this time you don't get much sleep, do you?
Well, you know what's crazy about that particular one? I was on holiday, and I went away, and it was during the November international break, and I went away for the second week. I was away for the second week of that international break, and I kind of thought, by the time I went, I was like, I think you're safe, because if it was going to happen, it was going to happen. It would happen in the first week, because surely they'd want to do it. If they knew they were going to do it, they'd do it, and then they want to give themselves as much time as possible. That was the conventional wisdom. So I kind of went away and was safe. And where I was the night that Pochettino was sacked, I had no phone reception, and kind of had actually managed to sort of switch off from work, and then woke up. My phone, when I drove into reception, my phone was just like going crazy. But yeah, times like that. I mean, recently, even with the Conte, the Nuno sacking Conte appointment, back end of last year, or October, November sort of time, that was one of those weeks where you're just being pulled from pillar to post a little bit, because there's so much stuff going on. There are so many angles, and like for us on The Athletic, we do kind of big meaty reads, and those take a long, they take a lot of time to put together. And obviously you don't have that time though when it's something like a managerial appointment. You're kind of having to do reads that might take a week or two in a day or two. So it's calling up tons of people, tons of contacts to try and get the info that you need, and then trying to piece it together in a coherent way. And you're aware that fans are just ravenous to read stuff. You know what it's like when there's a new manager or a new signing or anything like that. There's just so much appetite. So it's kind of overwhelming, and you're putting it out and trying to stay on top of all the news as well that's kind of breaking. So yeah, those weeks can be exhausting. I mean, yeah, that's kind of the nature of it. And there'll be, you'll go to games as well, that finish by the time you're home and written all your stuff. It's the early hours, but then you're up the next morning because you know that there's more to be done on it. There's so much reaction that needs doing, or there might be a press conference that day, or both. So yeah, it can be quite short on sleep, and that's kind of the nature of it. And the thing is, with the job, there's always more you could be doing. So it's kind of finite in a way, especially for us at The Athletic, because you've always got pieces in the pipeline. Yeah, it's good though. That adrenaline rush is often the most exciting part of the job as well.
Now, Charlie, before we talk about the transfer window, which of course is why a lot of people are viewing this evening, just want to take a question here from Mr. K. What do you enjoy more, interviewing players or managers? And have you got any particular favourites?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the obvious caveat is it depends who the manager or who the player is. I mean, managers often have more experience to bear. The chances are they're going to be that much older, and they might have tons of stories to tell and this sort of thing. I mean, players is an interesting one. I mean, I interviewed Ben Davis a one-on-one thing at the stadium back end of last year, and he was really engaging, really relaxed. But it can really depend, because sometimes it depends how the club are doing as well. It makes a really big difference, because at that time, Conte had recently come in, the results were good, and I think everyone just feels that lightness, and they're willing to talk. When things aren't going so well, and everyone's a bit closed off, and not wanting to give too much away. I mean, often as well, what you'll find, and I don't know if the question pertains specifically to Tottenham or more generally, but what you'll find often is when players have left the club, they're more willing to open up, because when it's your employer, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you necessarily. So what can be a sweet spot, you talk to someone who's recently left or hasn't been there a while, and they're doing that a bit, and they're like, okay, I've got some some scores to settle, and that's often a sweet spot. But that's one of the great parts of the job is getting to interview players and managers and execs and things like that. And I would say as well, like I think footballers get a hard time. I think they're unfairly characterized as being stupid or whatever, and I just think it's nonsense. And And often players, if you give them a platform and you talk to them about topics they're interested in as well, because you have to remember they're human beings and it can be boring for them answering the same questions over and over again. And I think if you can engage them on topics often outside of football, because most of them have other interests, and it's about sort of finding that, what that topic is. And when I spoke to Ben Davis, I lighted upon the fact that he'd been doing an economics degree at the Open University, and he was really happy to talk about that sort of thing, because there's only so much he can talk about overlapping runs down the left, which he's happy to talk about. But so I think people would be surprised at how open footballers can be, and I would say this, I'm biased as a journalist, but I think the more clubs can put up players and show their personalities rather than trying to suppress those personalities and making them all robots, is the better for everyone, because I think fans love seeing who the players really are, rather than getting a kind of filtered version.
Well, I'm waiting actually for the next couple of years when all you journalists get the exclusive from Danny Rose. That'll be interesting.
It's funny you say that. That thought occurred to me today. Actually, I was thinking, just kind of remember. My mind went back to obviously that famous interview he gave with the Sun about having to Google players, not having to Google players, and all of this sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, he's obviously a very, very engaging, interesting person, and yet he is going to have much to say whenever he does decide to give another interview. Well,
Charlie, you've mentioned Googling players, so let's get on to the transfer window. Now, of course, as you well know, Antonio Conte has said, I've given the club my vision. I know it's difficult in January, but we will try to improve. Daniel Levy in the Amazon documentary said, I get very frustrated if at the end of the transfer window, the team is not in a better place than it started. Now, there has been so many rumours and reports about the Adama Traore deal being very close. How close is this deal at the moment?
It is close, but it has been close for a few days, really. I mean, my information was from, I don't think exactly when it was, but about middle to the latter part of last week. The impression I was given was, it's going to happen. We're now at the stage where it's kind of that brinkmanship point where both teams want to get the absolute best for themselves. And Wolves have an amount they want Spurs to go to, around £20 million. Spurs don't quite want to go that high. And so there's a little bit of chicken, who's going to blink first. We know that Daniel Levy is either very good or very bad in this situation. Slightly depends on your perspective. I mean, he's very good in that he does tend to get what he wants. Some would say he's very bad in that he can push things a little bit too far. And take things later than they need to. I mean, the interesting thing here in a way is that there are no more games between now and the closure of the window. Yeah. So on one hand, that could speed things up. On the other, it could slow things down because there's not the immediacy to actually make it happen. But we're close. I mean, it is now kind of haggling over those final amounts. I don't know, and I don't think anyone can say for certain whether it's going to be one that's absolutely imminent or whether it does drag on a bit longer. The problem is you can't always foresee, because there are sometimes little complications that need to be resolved. I don't think it's not going to be anything serious. It is going to happen. I feel very confident about that. So I think fans can relax in a way. I know that we always want these to be done quickly because we're all refreshing our Twitter and our Google searches of Adama Traore, but I think he will become a Tottenham player by the time of their next game, and that's the main thing. And I don't know how you feel, and I'm always interested to hear how Spurs fans feel on this, because I've been slightly surprised. To me, it feels like quite an exciting signing, but I know from talking to Tottenham fans and colleagues, I'm maybe in the minority there. I think I think his lack of end product is an issue for some, but yeah, to me, I think he could do good things under Conte.
Charlie, surely he's being brought in though as a right wing back, yeah?
That's the idea, yeah. And yeah, I've been speaking to people who've worked with him and who know him, and there's confidence that he'll be able to do that. I mean, he's done it a bit for Wolves. The interesting thing actually is that he did it for Wolves a bit at the start of the 1920 season when Matt Doherty was injured. So he was kind of filling in for Doherty, and he said at the time about how he was, you know, looking at what Doherty had done as kind of the benchmark. So it's quite funny that they could be reunited, or possibly not if Doherty moves on. But yeah, that's the idea. I mean, it may not work, but if it doesn't work, then you still have a pretty full winger to go in your squad. But I mean, obviously, the one that the name that jumps to mind for everyone is Victor Moses, because he was converted from being a winger to a right wing back under Conte and was a revelation in that 16-17 season where Chelsea won the league. So, you know, I think everyone's hoping Traore could be the next Moses. And what excites me is, you know, the idea of him attacking from those deep positions, because I just don't think there are many left backs who are going to be relishing that prospect. And I thought it was interesting in the second half of the Leicester game when Matt Doherty came on. And, you know, Matt Doherty is not someone who is held in particularly high esteem by Tottenham fans, but that is his position and he rarely gets to play there. And I thought it made a massive difference, the fact that you had Reguilon on the left, Doherty on the right, and you actually had a threat from both flanks, which Spurs just haven't really had with Emerson Royale, who is a good defender, but he's not great going forward. And just having Doherty made a big difference. So I did start to think, well, you know, if you've got someone like Traore who can really be a threat on that side, then I think that's gonna be hard for opposition teams. And if you cast your mind back to the peak Pochettino time, that 16-17 season, in the first half of that, you had Danny Rose and Kyle Walker. And even then, when Rose was injured, Ben Davis was a very different Ben Davis to what he is now. He would do a similar thing and get up and down that left flank. And if Walker was out, Kieran Trippier would come in. That was when Spurs were just terrifying to opposition teams. They just pin them back. And I think Conte's going to want something similar. And Traore, even when his end product isn't amazing, he occupies defenders. So I think it could make a big difference for Tottenham, and they only need to improve a little bit to really push on and get top four. Obviously, beyond that, they do need to make some pretty big improvements, but could be a really useful signing to push them over the line into those Champions League places.
Charlie, will this be an Antonio Conte signing though? Because of course the club wanted him in the summer.
Yeah, I mean Fabio Paratici is a big admirer, and he, along with Nuno, who obviously knew him from his Wolves days, was a big admirer as well. So it's not just a Conte signing. Yeah, Paratici is heavily involved, but Conte has a say. You know, he has a degree of, maybe autonomy is too far, because Paratici is so heavily involved and has a lot of authority and power himself. But yeah, this is not someone being foisted upon Conte, from what I've been told. And you know, it's fairly clear to see where he would fit in that Conte system as the right wing back. And hopefully, yeah, Moses is the kind of paradigm that he works towards, and we can see something similar from Adama.
Charlie, as you well know, we're being linked with so many names in this transfer window. How confident are you that Tottenham will sign other players apart from Adama Traore in this next 7 days?
Reasonably confident. But the thing I would say is that it's not a simple. When Conte was at Chelsea, and you've got Roman Abramovich and you've got the riches that they have, it was more a question of, I need this player, can you get me this player? Now, there is a sense to which it's not totally in Tottenham's hands, because not entirely, but to an extent, and this is what I've been told from the very start of the transfer window and before, is that Tottenham do need to move players on if they want to bring in a substantial number of players. So it's all well and good Paratici hammering his phone until that O2 contract is maxed out. But ultimately, if you can't find a buyer for Dele Alli, for Tanguy Ndombele, for Giovanni Lo Celso, then your hands are to a certain extent tied. And so as much as I think they are desperate to do these deals and are doing everything they can to bring players in, there is an extent to which they do need to be smart with their sales as well and find buyers. And now we know PSG want Tanguy and Ndombele, but are they going to offer Daniel Levy and Tottenham what they want? And what Tottenham want is for a club to pay 100% of his wages. That's 200 grand a week. It's a lot of money. Dele Alli, Newcastle are interested, but they're interested in a lot of players. Are they going to, not get their other targets? Are they going to push the boat out? So many moving parts. Giovanni Lo Celso, there's some interest in Spain, and Spurs have been looking at swap deals, as they are to an extent as well with Tanguy and Ndombele, because they're PSG are kind of trying to offer quite a few of their fringe players as well, but there's a problem there because they're on huge wages, so they're not that interested in moving. My sense is that as we get close to the deadline, we will start to see that movement, and that some of those players, they will be able to move on. And once they move them on, they've got the space in the squad. They've got some more funds that they can actually go and make some of those signings that they want. But we know as well how Paratici operates. He likes to have lots of irons in the fire, and that's why you're seeing and you'll continue to see Spurs linked with so many players. That doesn't mean that's wrong. It just means that they are making inquiries about a number of different players because they need to keep their options open, because they're aware that other clubs might come in and poach one of their top two targets in the time where they're waiting to see if they can move on Ndombele or Lo Celso or Dele. Or even it could be Matt Doherty, could be Joe Rodon. AC Milan are in talks with them about Japhet Tanganga. So that's 6 players. And you know what it's like. It might be that 2, 3 of them come off. If they do, then I think Spurs are in a position to make a move for some players above and beyond Traore, which I think is going to happen almost regardless. Although it would certainly help if Spurs could move some players on as well. So yeah, and that's why it is so complicated. And I think I can totally see why there's a view, that Spurs are so close to getting the top 4. Surely it would save the money in the long term, given the riches of the Champions League, to just spend X amount now, get in a player or 2, and then, if it massively increase your chances of getting those huge riches that the Champions League brings. But it is hard because there isn't tons of money available and there isn't tons of space in the squad available. And this is really what we're seeing is years of pretty ropey recruitment coming back to bite Spurs in the arse, because the fact that they're desperately trying to flog Tanguy and Ndombele, Giovanni Lo Celso, these are guys that cost them huge amounts of money only 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago in Lo Celso's case, because his loan didn't get made permanent technically till January 2020. And that's an issue, because Tottenham, they're not a club. I mean, Chelsea, we saw the difference in quality between those two sides over the last few weeks, but Chelsea can afford to sign players for 40 odd million and it not work out. Doesn't matter. They can go and sign more. Look at Kepa, most expensive goalkeeper ever, and he doesn't get in their team, and that's fine. They can just go out and buy another one. They've got so many players like that who spent 30, 40 million on. Spurs don't have that luxury. They need to get those signings right, or they find themselves in this position where they can't really go out and buy new players because they're desperately trying to flog the old ones and they can't find buyers. So that's the challenge. And hopefully, I mean, the dream, and this may be far-fetched and we'll see, is that they stop making those mistakes and then they can build in a more sensible, sustainable way. But until they sort of rid themselves of the errors of the last few years, then that is a little handicap they've got to deal with. And they've got big decisions to make. Someone like Tanguy Ndombele, he's contracted until 2025 on 200 grand a week in what is the most pre-pandemic signing possibly of all time. I mean, you think of that money. They spent 55 million fee, let alone then the 6-year deal and 200 grand a week. That's going to be really hard to shift. And I feel they might just be loaning him out until that time comes, that his contract finally comes to an end.
We'll come on to departures shortly, but I just wanted to talk about, you mentioned Tanguy Ndombele and Lo Celso there, but 2 players that we brought in the summer, Emerson Royal and Brian Hill, it now looks like if Adama Traore comes in, Royale will then be sitting on the bench, and now there's a lot of talk about Bryan Hill possibly going out on loan, and these are two players that have only just arrived.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder with Emerson Royale if he'd actually, in a back three, whether he'd be better suited to playing as a right-sided centre-back in the way that what Conte did with Azpilicueta to really good effect. You know, he's a more defensive fullback. I think that could actually work quite well for Royale because I think he's, and you're seeing that with Ben Davis as well. You can't imagine Ben Davis now playing as an attacking fullback and certainly not as a wing-back, but he's perfect as that left-sided centre-back. Because you get so much more space to attack, and any attacking skills you have is almost a bonus. Whereas as a wing back, you're not far off a winger. A huge amount is expected of you, and I don't think Emerson Royale doesn't have that. That's not his game. When they signed him, and I was speaking to people in Brazil and in Spain, and I think it's funny with Royale because he's Brazilian and a fullback, and especially a right back. I think most Spurs fans are thinking, okay, this guy's going to be like Cafu and Maicon rolled into one. That's our stereotype of Brazilian fullbacks. We don't think of them as being kind of solid, sturdy, reliable, almost, like a Ben Davis equivalent. But that is kind of Emerson Royale's game. He's good defensively. He's not a swashbuckling, I'm going to beat you attacking fullback. So I do wonder if he could, if that might maybe be a lifeline for him as a right-sided centre-back. Bryan Hill, yeah, I mean, that's one where, again, a lot of excitement. I thought that could be a really exciting signing. It still could, let's not forget he's very early on in his Spurs career. He's very young. I think he's been one of the guys who's paid the price for that disastrous Europa Conference League campaign, where that should have been a really good opportunity for guys like him to get some minutes and impress and then maybe push for a place in the league team. But obviously it was so dysfunctional. And I think so much of that, by the way, is not having a second striker who can come in and stitch that team together and make guys like Bryan Hill have a worthwhile time of it. The fact that they don't, and either Harry Kane's having to play or come off the bench and salvage things, or if he's not, then like you saw in that game against Morecambe, you've got Dele Alli kind of playing as a makeshift striker, and then Bryan Hill's playing off him. I don't think Bryan Hill's going to learn a huge amount playing off a striker who similarly is trying to work out what on earth am I doing here, or bless him, he tried his hardest, but Dane Scarlett played in those Europa Conference League games and he just wasn't ready. And so I think I don't think the club have done great by Bryan Hill in the first half of the season, put it that way, because I just feel like a lot of those games he's played, like I was at the Vitesse Arnhem game in Holland and again, Scarlett was playing as the lone striker there. And I don't think Hill really saw much of the ball. There wasn't much there. The team was completely, it was a mess, really. So I have some sympathy for him. But the broader point is that the jury's definitely out on Paratici's first transfer window, which was the summer just gone. Because of the players that have come in, Romero is the big one, and I think he will be a big success, but he's been injured for a lot of the season. And then who have you got, really? I mean, Hill's barely played. Royale's not really, I mean, he's been fine, but he's not set the world alight. Galini has not even come close to challenging Lloris for that number one spot. Obviously, Sarr went straight on loan, so I think he'll still be a good signing. But yeah, I think Paratici in the eyes of Spurs fans still has a lot to prove. And also, it is interesting if you look at that summer window. Lots of those deals were swaps and loans. Even Romero was a loan. With the option to buy for a lot of money this summer coming, which does give you a little bit of an indication as to where Spurs are at. There wasn't tons of money sloshing around in the summer, which is kind of normally the bigger window. So I don't think we should expect there to be tons in January either, as frustrating as that can be for supporters when it does feel like top four is tantalisingly within reach.
Charlie, you mentioned the Europa Conference League there. I went to every single away game and still didn't see Tottenham win an away game in that competition.
Yeah.
That's a very sore point, actually. Let's talk about strikers, though, because I cannot believe the stat. 2017 was the last time that Spurs actually signed a striker on a permanent basis. Of course, we had Carlos Vinicius on loan last season. Why on earth did Tottenham Hotspur not sign a striker in the transfer window? Because all of us fans, we always say every window, got to sign a striker. Never happens.
Yeah, and I think Vinicius is actually quite a good example of the benefit of just having anyone, because Vinicius, for all he became a bit of a figure of fun with that sort of folded arm celebration away at Marine, who were in like the 25th tier of English football, and he'd scored from a yard out and was celebrating as if he was some absolute don. Wasn't the best look, but take that away, he scored 10 goals across all competitions. And I looked at this for a piece. I think he gave Kane something like 4 or 5 full nights off. That's really important. We've said that before with Harry Kane, how overworked he is, and then he gave him a few nights where he came on off the bench, and that makes a big difference. And Kane had his best season in a long while last year with from a goals and assists point of view, certainly. So I think Vinicius showed that even if they're not amazing, just having a striker is really, really important. And it feels amazing. It feels like such a kind of retrograde step that having done that, because the previous season there wasn't one in between him and Llorente, to then go back to not having one is just incredible. And we've all heard it so many times, the kind of Kane conundrum that is presented, because Kane is so good, he's going to start every single game, so who wants to come and sit on the bench, which I have some sympathy for, but that makes it hard. That doesn't make it impossible. And also, there are plenty of people who can play as a wide forward, but also as a striker. So even someone like Son Heung-min, who obviously his preferred position is a wide forward, but can also play up top. So you would have thought there'd be someone who you could buy who isn't just, even if you are saying that it's so hard to find a striker. I think you can find someone who does play mainly, you're saying to him, look, you'll play all the European group games, certainly in Conference League, Europa, you'll play in the League Cup and the FA Cup early rounds. That's still saying to someone, you're probably getting double figure starts, and then anything on top of that, and also saying to someone, will back yourself, try and make it so that he can't drop you, and you tweak the system or whatever it is, or you just find someone who can play also as a wide forward, or also can play as a support striker, or whatever it is, so that they can play instead of Kane, but they can also play as well as him. It is incredible. And that Morecambe game, watching that and watching Delhi, and this is not a criticism of Delhi, but he's not a striker, him kind of fumbling around trying to play that role. And what people forget is that striker is one of the most specialized positions. It's not, it's not like Sunday League where you can say to your big mate, can you go up there and win some headers? Like, to play as a striker, a lot of what you're doing is making really selfless runs off the ball where you don't get found. You don't get found 9 out of 10 times, but you need to keep making those runs. And you need to know how to make those runs. It's really, really hard, often quite unglamorous position, which people don't really think about, because we think about, you get the goals and you get the tap-ins. But you get the tap-ins by making tons of runs beforehand that lead to nothing. So it is infuriating. And that is something they're trying to address this window. But this, in a way, it's slightly locking the door after the horse is bolted, because whoever it is would have had more opportunities in the first half of the season than they will in the second, because Spurs won't have. I mean, they'll have a lot of games because there's a Premier League backlog, but they're out of Europe, so they're out of the League Cup. Very interesting to see, especially mid-season. If you are having a good season, do you want to give that up to go and, if you are an out-and-out striker, play for a team that are no longer in Europe, and you've got one of the best strikers in the world in front of you. So it's another big challenge. But I do think they'd be wise to play someone who can also play in other positions in the front three.
Charlie, Antonio Conte has come out and said a number of times now that he's evaluated the squad and he's given his list of requirements to the board. What do you think is his list of requirements and his evaluations, if you had to guess? And, what positions, if we signed Adama Traore tomorrow, say, what other positions are we really targeting and is a priority for this window?
So another forward and another central midfielder. They're the big ones. We had thought that he wanted a defender as well. I understand now that's less of a priority. I guess because they have defended quite well, and it feels like the central midfield and forwards are more pressing. When it comes to making his evaluations and what sort of qualities are you looking to? Well, there are a few things that jump out to me. One is selflessness and an ability to give yourself up for the team, for the project. And let's look at Tanguy Ndombele, because I think that's probably the most obvious case of someone who he's made his evaluation of and said, nah, not for me. And really telling from early on, and this was actually in one of the in-person press conferences, because I can remember it. Conte was asked, what have you made of Tanguy Ndombele? And it was so early on. And often when you ask a coach about a player, and this is why it's worth asking them about players, because you might, again, like with the analogy of the striker who makes the runs and gets nowhere 9 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, you ask a manager about a player and they might say, give you a boilerplate answer of, yeah, no, he's good, and he'll get his chance, because they don't want to, hang him out to dry, whatever. In this instance, Conte was very frank and said something like, well, he needs to work a lot harder. He doesn't give himself up for the team. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was more or less this. And we were all kind of looking at each other like, oh, that's pretty big to say about him. And he said similar since, he's just said he's not, he doesn't give himself up in the way that I want. Whereas he's drawn comparisons with someone like Harry Winks and said how reliable Harry Winks is, how much he fights for the team. So these are the qualities that are so, so important for him. It's not even just ability, which is obviously important, but I think Conte backs himself to be able to mold most players if they've got the right attitude. That is more important, I think, in lots of ways. And someone like Lo Celso, who I don't think he's hugely keen on his attitude either, and that's not something that's unique to Antonio Conte. So I think he's saying to the board, look, I've made my evaluations, and these are the guys who I don't think are ever going to work in my project. And I want you to find people with the right mentality, the right attitude, the right flexibility to learn, because, we know what it's like with Conte. It's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. I'm going to push you. And to a large extent, you're not going to like it for the first few weeks. But, you hear Conte, there are sort of Conte buzzwords. You're going to have to suffer. We're going to have to suffer. We're going to have to suffer. That's something. And how are we going to get there? Because we're going to work. We're going to work. We're going to work. So you need people who are receptive to that, and not just receptive, will thrive under it. And that's why he's loved working with Harry Kane, because Harry Kane is like the ultimate workaholic. But so those are what the kinds of things that have been saying in those meetings where he's made his case. He said to them, I've made my evaluations, and this sort of scene. These are the guys who don't tick my boxes, and I need some guys who do.
Charlie, talking about possible outgoings in this window, you've mentioned Tanguy Ndombele and Giovanni Lo Celso and of course Dele Alli. What are the chances realistically of offloading these three in this window? Because when I looked at the stats today, £100 million for Tanguy Ndombele and Lo Celso, and between Lo Celso and Ndombele, they've completed 90 minutes in the Premier League 16 times between them. That is a ridiculous stat.
Yeah, it's let's hope none of the prospective buyers are reading or those stats or hearing or watching now, because they'll probably be they'll be warned off.
But honestly, who's going to pay £200,000 a week for Tanguy Ndombele? The amount of times that I've had Spurs fans on this channel, and we've all said, we've seen glimpses of brilliance from him, but what a waste of talent. And when someone's picking up £200,000 a week, what club around Europe or indeed the world is going to come in and pay that money? And of course, we've seen the reports stating that Spurs now want whatever club do come in to pay, the full wage.
Yeah, and that's why PSG is one of the only viable destinations in the world, because unless you're, trying to send them to a club in the Middle East, there's no one else who's going to come close to that. And even PSG is saying, understandably, we don't want to pay that. I mean, we know he's not worth that. That's been evident for the last 2.5 years. So the only way that deal happens is if Spurs compromise and say, all right, you can pay some of it, we'll pick up the rest, and we'll just write it off as a terrible investment and something we learn from. Or they say, no, we can't accept having to pay that and not having him. Sorry, Antonio, you're going to have to reintegrate him. But that's the one. I mean, but that's been the issue for so long. I mean, summer of 2020, they wanted him to go. They were very happy for him to go. No one was going to pay it. I mean, that was just after the pandemic had started. That wasn't possible. Some are just gone. Same thing. He tells them he wants out. They're like, okay, fine. They're trying to find a club. And also bear in mind, Ndombele wants to play at a top European club. And to be fair, they're the only ones probably that could afford him, unless you're someone like Newcastle, and he's like, well, I'm not going to go there. But he holds all the power. That's the problem Spurs have. They've given him this contract. No one made them do that. And so he will, until there's someone willing to pay what he wants, or that between a prospective club and Spurs, they can pay that amount, he can sit tight, really. And that is his right. He's got that contract. He doesn't need to... he doesn't need to move, really. And then it's just a case of the Spurs will get to a point, unless PSG blink and they agree to pay his wages, Spurs get to a point where they say, well, is it actually more damaging to us to have him at the club where Conte doesn't want him, or do we just write off some of that amount if it means getting him off our books for now? And then they might pray, possibly naively, but they might pray, well, he could go to PSG, do okay, fit into that team, and bear in mind as well that Pochettino is who signed him at Spurs, and Pochettino leaving was such a massive moment for Ndombele. This is a piece I wrote recently. That is a, there are people close to Ndombele, close to Pochettino, close to the club, who do believe it could have been really different if Pochettino had stayed. Bear in mind he was replaced by Jose Mourinho, diametrically opposed to Pochettino, and Ndombele was kind of collateral damage in all of that. So yeah, they'll be hoping Pochettino can work his magic again, and PSG will say, oh, actually, brilliant. We loved having him on loan. We'll take him off your hands. Okay, here you go. But that might seem fanciful at this point. Lo Celso stock in Spain is still reasonably high. I mean, bear in mind, he had a great last season at Betis before he joined Tottenham in the summer of 2019. So, he has his admirers there. Dele Alli, I mean, Newcastle, they may come in for him ultimately. Everton was another club I've had mentioned, but I've also had people saying, not sure if they'll do that. Bear in mind, Dele Alli's on very, very high wages as well. So it's hard. It's really, really hard. And the problem that Spurs have, and that a lot of clubs have, is that these players were given wages pre-pandemic, and it's going to be a number of years, 2 or 3 years more before all of those, in Tanguy Ndombele's case, not until 2025, but until all of those pre-pandemic contracts run out, and the game can kind of reset a little bit, because all of these clubs are paying for the excesses of the pre-pandemic world, where there was this bubble that people thought was never going to burst. I mean, you look at some of the deals that were done in that kind of 2018, 2019 period, where it was just building up and up and up and up. And I think Ndombele is probably the starkest example, certainly for Spurs, but possibly for anyone in the Premier League. And it's going to be a real challenge. That is one of the biggest things. One of the biggest challenges Spurs have is finding buyers for them, and actually that's an issue that for them predates the pandemic. They've not been very good sellers. Think of that peak Pochettino team. So many players that now, I'm sure in retrospect, Daniel Levy must think, I could have sold Rose for 50 odd million, could have sold Dele for close to 100. 2018, Coutinho went for 100 million in January 2018, and I reckon Dele could have, at the time, people would have said Dele was worth about the same, if not more. I think Coutinho was actually 120 million. Christian Eriksen, how much he could have gone for. Toby Alderweireld, so many players that they didn't cash in on, held on to for too long, either are still at the club or they sold for a fraction of what they could have. And they've got to get that right. But now they're in a tough position. They've lost the strength that they had then, really. And that's why now they're desperately trying to shift players, not even to get fees and just please players' wages. And even that's proving difficult.
Is it fair to say then, Charlie, that if we don't offload Ndombele, Lo Celso and Dele Alli in this transfer window, it would be very difficult to bring players in?
Yeah, I think if none of those three go, then yeah, it's a big challenge, and it would require, given that we're assuming Traore would have already come in for decent money. I mean, because also that's something Spurs were pushing for a loan for Traore and then signing him in the summer. Not something that Wolves really were interested in. If they don't sell any of those players, then it does become very difficult, or they have to pivot away from their intended policy this month, which wasn't to spend a huge amount, which was communicated to Antonio Conte when he took the job. But I do think Conte, as much as he took that on board, I think the kind of fiercely competitive winner that he is, thought that, okay, you've told me there's not going to be a big budget in January, but hold on a minute. You saw that Mura performance, right, Daniel, Fabio? You saw the Chelsea trilogy of games. You know, you saw 70 minutes against Morecambe or whatever it is. I think, you know, he would have been like, but surely after that we have to, right? Because we're just not where I want us to be. But that's not really how it operates. You know, you can't. Spurs have not been a club generally where they've just gone out and you know, spent money that wasn't in line with their sustainable business model. And that would be that would be a departure if they're going to go out and spend much more on top of the Traore money without getting anyone out. That would be a big show of faith in Conte.
Charlie, how would you say that all the fans are saying at the moment, back Conte? What is the definition of backing Antonio Conte? Because when you bring in a world-class manager who is very used to spending a lot of money and, of course, improving players, as he has done at Spurs in the last couple of months since he's arrived, now, what is the definition of backing him?
Well, it is, for sure. It's going out and, you know, making the kind of signings that he wants. What I would say in the club's defence is they're not reneging on promises by not going and spending big in January. This was communicated in those initial meetings with Conte. He knew that, he understood it, he took it on board. But I do think, like I say, in his mind, the situation has changed because of things like Mura and the Chelsea games that have so exposed some of the weaknesses in the squad that maybe weren't apparent to him. And he's not sure was apparent to the Spurs hierarchy when they explained that their stance was to not spend a huge amount in January. But yeah, I mean, that is backing him. But also the club could say, well, we will back you in the summer when there are deals to be done. But it's a fascinating dynamic because they do have an elite coach in Antonio Conte who is used to being backed. And we know will express his frustrations if he isn't, but that might not always play well with those that are employing him if they feel that they've been fairly straight with him and that he knew the situation.
I've got to ask you, Charlie, while you're on, the fact that so many pundits are saying at the moment, if Antonio Conte isn't backed by the board in the right way, that he could walk. Do you have, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that could happen?
It's not something I've heard directly, and to be honest, I don't think anyone has. I think that is speculation based on how he's been after some of those Chelsea defeats. Certainly, the first one where he was very scratchy, very annoyed. He felt humiliated. That's the thing. He felt absolutely humiliated going back to his old club, his old employer, where he'd left in this acrimony. And they had swatted Spurs aside, and it was humiliating. I think that's why he reacted like he did. So that's not my sense. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but people are saying that, making a little bit of a leap based on how they know Conte to be, how he's presented. But he, for the moment, is bought into this project, and that's absolutely not to say it couldn't go. It couldn't all be kaput quite quickly because Conte is quite volatile. We know that. And this is Spurs, linking back to what we were talking about at the beginning. This is Tottenham and things happen. It's a very eventful, newsworthy club. But I don't think there's an imminent danger of him doing that. And I also, I am just optimistic that there will be moves. Spurs will make moves in the next week, enough to just about appease him. Summer could be a different story because I think if he doesn't feel like he's properly back then there'll be issues for sure.
Charlie, do you have any other names of players that Tottenham are looking at for this window?
I mean, there are some, as we know with Paratici, he's got a lot of contacts in Serie A, and Kessie is someone that's been mentioned quite a lot, and Spurs are big admirers of him. They're big admirers of Weston McKennie as well, or Paratici is as well. But not heard anything concrete that they're moving to get, that they are particularly likely to bring them in. I mean, Kessie is a hard one because he's out of contract in the summer, so both for him and for the club, it sort of makes sense to wait rather than rushing into something now. But those are the kind of signings Conte and Paratici like to make. You know, players, someone like Kessie who's out of contract, so they can get for nothing. You know, so Conte made a lot of free transfers, as you know, working with Paratici at Juventus. So I certainly wouldn't be surprised if it was someone from that Italian market that Paratici knows so well, where he's got so many good contacts. And also, Italy has far more of a culture of swap deals, and that's what Paratici is hoping to do to a certain extent here. A few names as well that over in Ligue 1, who I know Paratici's been talking to those clubs as well, and obviously with PSG, there are lots of players who PSG would be happy for them to take. Certainly, someone like Wijnaldum, but do they want to make the move, and can Spurs afford their wages? Probably not. Again, they'd have to take a pay cut. A lot of those guys at PSG are very happy just chilling where they are because they're on these huge contracts, similar to Ndombele.
Do you know what? That makes me feel very sad as a football fan, because recently I've had former Spurs players, Dean Austin and Ramon Vega, on, and they have both said that a number of these players are just happy not playing football and just collecting their salary. It makes me feel very sad as a football fan when I hear that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think for players, I mean, there are so many things, aren't there? It's a short career for a start. I mean, you'll have heard all this before, and it's a short career. It's a job. As much as they feel passionate about it, it is a job as well. Often, a lot of them have a lot of dependents, people who rely on their income, and they don't feel they can kind of play fast and loose with them, with that. And also, as supporters, we feel like we would play for free. But not many players feel like that. And they have to make a lot of sacrifices to get to be playing with their lifestyle now. And I'm afraid it is just a reality. There are some exceptions, but for most players, they feel that no one forced the club to put them on these contracts, and that once they're on them. And also there's the thing of relativity, isn't there? Because you see that someone who you think you're better than is on X amount, and you think, well, why should I take a cut or be paid less than what I'm on when I know I'm better than that guy? So yeah, there's a lot there, but I think certainly with a club like PSG, that is sort of the state of it, and that's why a lot of their players are just happy to stay where they are.
Charlie, are there any current Tottenham Hotspur players that you will be surprised if they're still there on the 1st of Feb? Because we haven't mentioned Matt Doherty. Do you think he could go? And then we've got Tanganga on loan, and Bergwijn, could he possibly move still, or has that Leicester game completely changed it?
Well, I mean, the situation there is that Ajax made a bid that was rejected. My understanding is that Spurs, told them that they wanted around 25 million euros, and the expectation is that Ajax weren't going to go that high, and that 25 million euros was before the Leicester game, so it's possible that might have added a little bit. So I don't think Ajax are going to go as high as what Tottenham want. And also, Bergwijn was a different case, whereas Dele and Ndombele and Lo Celso are people Conte and Spurs actively were trying to get rid of. Bergwijn was more a case of he's one of Spurs' few saleable assets, and there was interest for him, and that asked them the question: do you want to get rid of this guy? He wasn't one where Conte was like, no, I'm done with him. Conte likes him, and Spurs by and large were happy to keep him. It was more just the offer presented itself. But I don't think Ajax will go as high as what they want. And then the others, I mean, we've spoken about that central midfield trio. They're all very much open for transfer. Tanganga, Milan, and Spurs are in talks about a possible loan, but Spurs would like it. Spurs are wary of letting him go anyway because they could get injuries in that area, and they want, if he were to go, they'd want an option to buy. Milan want a straight loan. Doherty is available, though he's played better in recent games. I know that's maybe damning him with faint praise, and I know a lot of people would love to get rid of him. But yeah, it's those three plus Tanganga plus Dotti plus Joe Rodon. He's another one who really needs a loan. You know, he needs to play. But there's none that I'm sat here saying, yeah, they will definitely be gone. But I still think, on the balance of probabilities, I think there's more chance than Ndombele will be gone than he'll still be at Tottenham come February the 1st. But still a lot of hurdles, and I was told by sources close to the situation, when was it, back end of last week, that it was about 50-50 as to whether it would go through. You know, some small progress is being made. Those talks are ongoing. But none of these deals are straightforward because the clubs don't have the money that they used to. So I think a lot of them will go to the wire. But yeah, I think he's probably one you're saying. I'd be a little bit surprised if he was still there. Curious as well to see what happens, whether Conte bothers to reintegrate him, or you've got 200 grand a week asset playing with the under 23s, which is, you know, would be a pretty disastrous situation.
Charlie, last few questions for you. How many players do you think that we will get in? The league position where you think Spurs will finish at the end of the season? And a simple yes or no, will Antonio Conte be the next Spurs manager to lift a trophy?
Wow. Okay. I think 2, maybe 3 players will come in this window.
Do you know, everyone keeps saying this to me, but who are they? Who are they?
Well, Traore, and then 1/2 of the hundreds of players that Paratici will have inquired about. By the law of averages, 1 or 2 of them will land, and 1 or 2 of the departures will happen. Is my sense over the next week. But I mean, the variability on who that could be. I mean, that's ranging from so many different players. And then I think they'll finish 4th this season. Will Conte be next manager? I mean, that's really, really hard because I don't think he'll win a trophy. I mean, this season is basically, will they win the FA Cup? I would say probably not, because I think Man City tend to hoover up the cups. So going into next season, I'll go with yes. That he'll stay and win the League Cup next season. But I've totally just made that up on the spot. Don't go placing bets on that, anyone. That's not based on any proper thought out analysis.
No, I want you to write that in your next article, Charlie.
Yeah.
You know, Spurs going to win the League Cup now.
Exactly. Yeah. Why Spurs will win the 2023 Carabao Cup?
Do you know what though? All joking aside, if you go from Mauricio Pochettino to Jose Mourinho and Antonio Conte, and neither of them win a cup at Spurs, there's something seriously wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's the sense, isn't it, with Conte? It's like, if we can't make this work, then who are we going to make work? Because he feels as guaranteed, in inverted commas. You know, no one guarantees success, but as close to that as you can have. So yeah, for the sake of everyone's sanity, let's hope he does it.
Well, Charlie, I can't thank you enough for all of your time this evening, talking about the ins and outs, and hopefully we will sign a few players. Please tell everyone where they can find you on social media and your wonderful work.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at CD Eccleshare, and I tend to link to all my stuff there. And then on theathletic.co.uk, and there's a discount code as well. I think it's a third off if you go athletic.co.uk or athletic.com/SpursPod. That gets you a third off, and you can read all of my stuff and all our other stuff on Tottenham, but also everything across the app from all our amazing writers on football and also on American sports, if you're into that kind of thing.
Well, Charlie, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for watching this stream this evening. I'll see you on the next video. Until then, come on, you Spurs.
Thank you.